Thanks be to God indeed. The children's message gets "Come share my joy," and I get wailing and gnashing of teeth. Thanks be to God. Wailing and gnashing of teeth isn't really the best image to serve up as we look forward to gathering with friends and family this week to celebrate Thanksgiving. It's not the greatest image to land on as we focus on our stewardship campaign today, because giving should never be done out of guilt or fear of wailing and gnashing of teeth. Because hear me when I say this, that whether you are able to give a little, a lot, or nothing at all, you will always be welcome here. You will never be thrown out into the darkness. You won't have to wail or learn how to gnash your teeth. You have my word on that. I can't tell you how tempting it was to end our gospel reading at that halfway point, where the good and faithful workers are commended for their initiative and are invited to share the owner's joy. That lines up so nicely with our theme this morning of Dare to Rejoice. But there always seems to be a but. However unsettling I find this wailing and gnashing of teeth, the parable is not complete without this exchange between the owner and the third worker. As tempting as it was to end early, taken as a whole, this parable is rich with meaning. Like most parables, it challenges our expectation and it defies easy explanations. It makes us stop and take a closer look at what's going on. And like Jesus' other parables, there's always more than one way to read it. Is it allegory or expository? Is it descriptive of the situation or prescriptive of the ideal situation? The answer is yes. Both and. It's like one of those optical illusions where there's two pictures in one. Have you ever seen this? Maybe this picture that's an image of a rabbit, but also a duck. We don't have a screen up here, but if you want to look on your cell phones, I'll allow it. Look up rabbit duck, and you'll see this image. Or maybe you've seen this image that's both the face of an old woman wearing a headscarf and also the face of a young woman turning away. It's this optical illusion where there's two images in one. And sometimes it takes our brains a while to see the second image if we're not used to seeing it in a different way. If we're only used to seeing it in this one way. But once you see that second image, you can easily flip between the two, depending on what you decide to focus on. And that's what it's been like for me this week, as I've spent time with this parable. Just when I thought I had it in focus, I would blink and see it from a very different angle. Every time I tried to nail it down and say, this is what it says, it would slip away from me, and I could almost hear the Spirit whisper, "But what about this? Have you considered it from this side?" It was frustrating, to say the least, but the truth is that there are two sides to this story, two ways of reading it. One is more traditional, while the other is more subversive. One is more allegorical, while the other is more literal. Two perspectives, each with its own insights, each with its own problems. But taken together, they help us to see and understand what it means to be good and faithful stewards. You get a 2-for-1 this morning. This takes a little bit of unpacking, so I invite you to walk with me through this well-known parable. Though the landscape may seem very familiar, I ask you to take a moment and maybe see a rabbit where you once only saw a duck. So we begin with the traditional allegorical reading. This is the interpretation that we've all heard before in one form or another, where everything in the story represents something else. The landowner is God. Very good. This is the interactive portion. Yeah. The landowner is God, or in some cases Jesus, who entrusts his servants, aka us, very good, with various talents according to our different abilities. And while in the parable talents are monetary units, they have come to mean talents more generally. Cooking, singing, painting, our spiritual gifts. Yeah, that's kind of what the talents have come to mean. So then Jesus, or God, the owner, leaves to go to heaven for a bit, but will eventually return to demand a reckoning of what we, the servants, have done with our talents. Right? Does this sound familiar? The moral being that we should not hide our talents, but use them faithfully to increase God's kingdom. Here, the third servant suffers because he hid his talent out of fear. Believing the owner to be ruthless and harsh, he buried the one talent he was given to keep it safe. Moral being, don't hide your talents. This is a powerful reading with a profound message. It challenges our perception of God and shows us that being good and faithful servants means knowing and following the master's example. It means taking risks and being fully invested in the work of God's kingdom. One problem with this interpretation centers on the nature of the owner, right? The third servant says, knowing your ruthlessness and fearing your wrath. The third servant paints a problematic picture of a God who's often characterized as slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love. A God who continually calls people to fear not and provides for the forgiveness of sins. Now, maybe the owner is ruthless. Maybe the other two servants were also acting out of fear, frantically working to double the master's money. Or maybe the two other servants had a different perception of their master. Maybe they saw the master as someone who valued taking risks, as someone who would forgive their mistakes and reward their initiative. Because we only ever see the master through the eyes of the third servant, we don't really know what the master is like. All we're told is that the third servant acted according to his perception of the master. From him, we learn that what we do is an outgrowth of what we believe. So if we believe that God is love, our actions better back that up. It's in this reading that the good and faithful servants were willing to take a risk, willing to trust that the master would honor their initiative. They could have held back some of those talents, just in case, but they stepped out in faith to invest everything that they had been given. They didn't let their fear hold them back. They were fully invested in the well-being of the owner's household and they were rewarded for taking a risk, while their fellow worker suffered the reality of his fear. By the end of the reading of this parable, the irony is that the biggest risk was not to have risked anything. As one scholar wrote, the greatest risk of all, it turns out, is not to risk anything, not to care deeply and profoundly enough about anything to invest deeply, to give your heart away, and in the process risk everything. The greatest risk of all, it turns out, is to play it safe, to live cautiously and prudently. In this reading, being a good and faithful steward means to not let fear keep you from fully investing yourself in God's work. It means stepping out in faith to love God, to love others, and to love yourself. That's one reading. That's the image that I wanted to lift up and to celebrate this morning. It's how I wanted to encourage you to step out and to take a risk, that you might dare to rejoice with the Master. But sometimes being a good and faithful servant comes at a cost. Another way to read this parable takes an honest look at the call to risk everything and the cost of doing so. A second way to read this parable is to take it at its face value, to read it as a literal explanation rather than an abstract illustration. Instead of seeing everything as representing something else, a second look sees the wealthy landowner as just a wealthy landowner. Someone who reaped where he didn't sow and gathered where he didn't plant. Someone who got rich off the labor of others. Who participated in an oppressive money-lending scheme, making loans, charging exorbitant interest rates, and then seizing everything that a person had when they couldn't pay. A wealthy landowner who stashed his wealth in offshore accounts to avoid paying taxes. A wealthy landowner is a wealthy landowner. In this parable, we find ourselves in a similar situation to what we see today. It says it in the parable. It describes how the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And instead of reading the workers as Jesus' followers, as us, trying to be faithful in Jesus' absence, what if we saw the workers as just workers, going along to get along, trying to play the game of the master to get rich, just like him? This makes the first two workers fellow pawns in the master's scheme to profit off the most vulnerable. And the third worker becomes the unlikely hero, as often is the case in Jesus' three-person parables. Think about the Good Samaritan. He was the third one that stopped. Following the law of Moses that forbid anyone to lend money with interest, the third worker refuses to participate in the corrupt and oppressive system designed to take everything from those who could least afford it. Instead, this brave worker calls out the powers that be. She calls the wealthy landowner a skleros, pardon my Greek. who is an offensive person, prone to violence, and thoroughly intolerable, as it says. She calls this wealthy landowner out on how he got his wealth, reaping where he didn't sow, and gathering where he didn't plant. She stops short of calling him out for collecting interest and confiscating collateral from people too poor to pay. But she still pays the price for speaking out against the oppressive system. Here, the good and faithful servant is the one that refuses to participate in the corrupt systems of the world, who speaks out against those systems and is consequently handed over to suffering and death. Does this sound familiar? However we choose to read or to look at this parable, the fact is that this is one of Jesus' final teachings to his disciples. Right after he gets done speaking, at this point, the passion narrative begins. At this point in his ministry, we find that Jesus embodies both versions of the good and faithful servant. Jesus knew what it meant to be fully invested, to risk everything for something bigger than himself. He took what he was given and poured it out freely and fully, investing it in the lives of everyone he met, holding nothing back. And at the end, Jesus was welcomed to share the joy of the Master. And Jesus, as the good and faithful servant, also knew the cost of standing up to the powers that be, of refusing to play by the rules of an oppressive regime. He brought good news to the poor, set captives free, healed the sick, ate with sinners, and paid the ultimate price. So, rabbit or duck? Yes. What does this mean as we dare to rejoice? As we gather to give thanks and rejoice in all that God has done and promised to us, it's important to remember that being faithful doesn't always come easy. Daring to share God's joy means daring to be faithful with everything entrusted to us. It means stepping out, stepping up, speaking out, and putting ourselves on the line for others. It means remembering that we were promised a good life, not an easy one. So as we dare to rejoice this morning, may you be commended for your faithfulness. And may God give you the courage to speak boldly, to love fully, and to live deeply, that we all might share in the joy of God Almighty. Amen.